This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neat Sahone, and today is Monday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In some episodes of this series, I take a look at the most expensive cards in a particular category and discuss what makes those cards so expensive, and that's what we're doing today with a look at instants. A few things to keep in mind about how I compile this type of list. First, a set can only appear once, so if a set would have multiple cards appear on the list, I simply took a look at the 3 most expensive cards from that set. This type of list is already going to be weighted towards much older sets, and this prevents that from being quite as pronounced. Additionally, I only count the regular versions of a card. In other words, no promotional or foil versions of cards are included. The prices in this video are the prices for that card in its original printing. Lastly, the prices in the video are Card Kingdom near mint prices, and as usual, if you want to own any of them, you can find links in the description. Alright, let's take a look at Magic's 10 most expensive instants. At number 10, it is Cyclonic Rift, which costs about $48. This 2-mana instant can bounce a non-land permanent to its owner's hand, but what really makes it great is the Overload option, which allows you to pay 7 mana to bounce all of your opponent's non-land permanents. This can really turn the game on its head and in your favor, as it makes your opponent rebuild their entire board, and because this is an instant, you can fire it off at a really inopportune time that even might make them discard some cards at the end of their turn. The Rift has seen significant play in Magic's 60-card constructed formats. Obviously, that 7 mana the Rift asks for is a lot, but there have been decks in multiple formats that were up to the challenge of generating that mana. In Standard, it was largely played in blue Devotion decks, which used Nykthos Shrine to Nyx to make all that mana, and in Modern, it's usually featured in blue Tron decks, which use the Urza lands to produce tons of mana. In Pioneer, Lotus Field decks can easily cast it with the Overload cost too. It is still seeing play in Modern and Pioneer these days. While the demand for the card in 60-card constructed formats is certainly a factor in its high price tag, the fact that it's a staple in Commander is even more important. It sees play in almost 400,000 decks on EDHREC, and is the second most heavily played mono-blue card in the entire format, behind only Counterspell. This effect becomes even more ridiculous in a multiplayer game since now you can bounce everyone's permanents except your own, allowing you to have quite the turn. Despite several reprints, the Rift is in such high demand that the price it demands continues to be quite high, and that probably isn't going to change anytime soon. At number 9, it is Eightfold Maze, which costs about $50. Full disclosure, this is a card that I didn't even know existed before I made this list, and that's not too surprising, since it's a fairly weak card from one of Magic's most obscure sets, Portal 3 Kingdoms. This set was mainly targeted at the Asian market and was meant to be an introductory product set during the real historical 3 Kingdoms period in China. These cards tend to be really rare because of their low supply, and even the bad ones end up costing a significant chunk of change, like Eightfold Maze. This is a 3-mana instant that destroys an attacking creature. You might be thinking, wait, it says it's a sorcery, and you'd be right. They thought the concept of fast effects as an entire card type was a bad idea in this introductory product, so instead they made this a sorcery that came with the ability to be cast at what we would call instant speed. Once portal sets became legal in Magic more broadly in 2005, they went back and errata the sorceries that could effectively be instants, and made them instants, like Eightfold Maze. It's never been played in Magic's 60-card formats, and it is very sparsely played in Commander, appearing in only 18 decks on EDHREC. So this card has very low demand, but it's also incredibly rare, so its value to collectors is the main driving force. At number 8, it is Shallow Grave, which costs about $51. This instant is a 2-mana reanimation spell that brings back the top creature card of your graveyard and gives it haste, then it gets exiled at the beginning of the next instep. Reanimator effects are quite strong when they cost so little, even if this one does come with several limitations. It's seen sporadic play in Reanimator decks in the Eternal formats over the years, and so far 2023 has actually been a pretty good year for it. The demand for this card in 60-card formats is pretty much at its peak right now. It also sees play in over 4,000 decks on EDHREC, a number that would almost certainly be higher if the card weren't so expensive. A major factor in Shallowgrave's price is its presence on the reserved list. This is a list of cards that Wizards of the Coast has promised not to reprint, so this Mirage version of Shallowgrave is the only one you can get, and assuming the reserved list continues to be a thing, it's the only version of it that will ever exist. Mirage came out in 1996, so there are only so many copies of Shallowgrave out there, so even though the demand for this card isn't insanely high, it is outstripping the card's supply right now. At number 6, it is Mindbreak Trap, which costs about $60. This 4-mana instant can exile any number of spells. That's a cool effect as it lets you interact with the stack, which means you can even stop things that would normally be uncounterable, or a million copies of a particular spell. It has the trap subtype, which means you end up getting some sort of bonus when something your opponent does meets a particular condition. In this case, if your opponent casts 3 or more spells in a turn, you can cast this for free. The most important thing that Mindbreak Trap does is that it hates on one of the game's most busted mechanics, Storm. It's very difficult to keep a Storm player from going off. That's why it's such a dominant deck in the Eternal formats, but Mindbreak Trap does it for you, even when you're tapped out. Sure, it takes your opponent casting 3 spells in a turn, but if your opponent is trying to kill you with Tendrils of Agony, well, they're going to be casting a ton of spells. Because of how Storm works, countering the copy your opponent casts doesn't stop the Storm copies, but Mindbreak Trap does, because it just exiles any and all spells from the stack. Obviously, this is devastating for a Storm player who will have a hard time winning if Mindbreak Trap resolves. As a result, the trap sees lots of play in Magic's most powerful formats, Legacy and Vintage, where Storm is at its strongest. Part of what makes it so appealing is that you don't even have to be a blue deck to make use of it, since in the right matchup, you can just always cast it for free. This makes it one of the most in-demand sideboard cards in all of Magic. While 60-card formats play the biggest role in its price tag, it also sees some modest play in Commander, where sometimes you can use this to exile spells from multiple opponents at once. At number 6, I have the 2 most expensive instants from Commander 2020. Fierce Guardianship, which costs about $70, and Deflecting Swat, which costs $60. They are part of a cycle of instants in Commander 2020, all of which are free if you control a commander. While they are all fairly pricey, these are the only 2 with a high enough price tag to make the list. Fierce Guardianship can counter a non-creature spell, and Deflecting Swat can change the targets of a spell or ability. Obviously enough, neither of these cards are good enough in 60-card constructed formats since you never have a commander there. It should come as no surprise, though, that they are great and heavily played in Commander, where it isn't that difficult to get these online for free. One of the great things about these 2 is that you can use them to protect your commander even if you tapped out to play it. Deflecting Swat is the 8th most heavily played mono red card, and Fierce Guardianship is the 9th most heavily played mono blue card. Right now, these cards exist only as a single printing from Commander 2020, so the demand is really high, and there are a limited number of copies of them out there. At number 5, it is Herkels Recall, which costs about $95. This 2-mana instant returns all artifacts that a player controls to their hand. This has a number of uses. Most obviously, it can hate on artifacts, as bouncing all of your opponents to their hand can often clear out an entire board against the right deck, and that's the way the Recall has been used the most often over the years, as a sideboard card in multiple formats. However, it's also been used in decks that want to use it for their own advantage. For example, some Storm decks in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage like to use it to recast a whole bunch of 0-mana artifacts, sending their Storm count through the roof and allowing them to win the game. In Modern, it's been used in a similar fashion. It's in high demand for Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and sees a bit of play in Commander too. It has received some reprints that can be obtained for significantly less, but the Antiquities version is the only way to get it with this art and with a black border, making it the most sought-after version of the card. At number 4, it is Force of Will, which costs about $110. This 5-mana instant can counter a spell, but what makes it really powerful is its alternate cost. You can also exile a blue card from your hand and pay 1 life to cast it for free. A free counter spell is a very powerful thing, as it allows you to protect your stuff and disrupt your opponent even when you're tapped out. This has led to it being one of the most important cards in Magic's Eternal formats, where it is incredibly heavily played. There are virtually no decks with a significant amount of blue in them that don't play Force of Will in Legacy and Vintage. It also shows up in over 130,000 decks in EDHREC, making it quite popular in that format too. This is arguably the strongest counterspell in all of Magic, and that means demand for it is going to continue to be extremely high going forward. At number 3, it is Intuition, which costs about $180. This 3-mana instant lets you search up any 3 cards in your deck. Then you reveal them to your opponent, and they have to choose one. The one they choose goes to your hand, and the other two go to the graveyard. Intuition ends up being a pretty powerful tutor, especially because you can simply search up 3 copies of the same card if that's what you need. You can also search up cards that are going to be great for you whether or not they end up in your hand or your graveyard, making your opponent's decision trivial. It has seen a lot of success in 60-card formats over its long history, often showing up in combo decks that could use it to find the key pieces for their combo. It has played this role the most prominently in both Extended and Legacy, with the card really experiencing its heyday from 1998 to 2005, though it does still see significant play in Legacy decks like Show and Tell. It's also in fairly high demand in Commander, as most tutors are. That said, you obviously can't use Intuition to search up 3 copies of the same card in that format, making it a little more of a niche card, but you can still really put your opponent in a pick-your-poison situation when you do cast this, even in a singleton format. Intuition is also on the reserve list, and so far your only options for the card are this original Tempest version or a Judge promo that costs 4 times as much. At number 2, it is Mana Drain, which costs about $200. This 2-mana instant counters a spell, and then during your next main phase you get X mana, where X is the mana value of the spell you countered. Obviously, this makes it strictly better than Counterspell these days, though it wasn't as clearly better than Counterspell in the days of Mana Burn. Back then, if you had unspent mana, you took damage for each of those mana, which meant that if you countered something and didn't cast a spell using that mana, sometimes you'd take significant damage. Still, even in the olden days of Mana Burn, Mana Drain was a great card. It has just become even better since that rule was eliminated. These days, the only 60-card constructed format in which it is legal is in Vintage, since it's banned in Legacy, and it doesn't see a ton of play there, as the plethora of free counter spells that are available, like Force of Will, keep it from being something that every blue deck wants. It is still played, don't get me wrong, just nowhere close to being a staple there. It is, however, heavily played in Commander, a format where there are lots of huge expensive spells you can counter with it, and then you also have a lot of your own expensive stuff to sink the mana into. In Commander, it's even more heavily played than Force of Will is. And at number 1, probably not surprising anyone, I have the 3 most expensive instants from Alpha. This is the first printing of Magic's very first set, and the cards from it are the rarest ones around. At the top of the list is Ancestral Recall, which costs a whopping $28,000. Then there's Fork at $4,000, and Word of Command at $3,300. Ancestral Recall is the only instant in the Power 9, and you can see why it's held in high regard amongst those other crazy powerful cards. You can pay 1 blue mana to draw 3 cards with it, which is an insane rate. Like the rest of the Power 9, it's part of the reserved list. It has long been banned in every format except for Vintage, where it's restricted, and it's also banned in Commander. It does appear in basically every blue deck in Vintage, so the demand is actually quite high, especially for a card that only exists in very few printings, with this original Alpha printing by far the rarest. Fork and Word of Command aren't anywhere close to as powerful as Ancestral Recall. Fork has a single major top 8 in its resume and sees modest play in Commander, while Word of Command sees sparse play in Commander and has never top 8'd anything. However, they have high price tags because they are both instants from Alpha that are on the reserved list, and they're pretty cool cards. Fork was the first card that ever allowed you to copy a spell, and Word of Command's incredibly complex effect lets you control your opponent for a part of their turn and make them cast a spell from their hand. Word of Command's minimalist art also has a lot of fans out there, though the story behind it is actually quite comical. As the set was going to the printer, they realized they didn't have the art for this card, so Jesper Meerfors just banged it out really fast so that it wouldn't just be blank, and that's how we ended up with 2 disembodied eyes as the art for Word of Command. To sum up, Ancestral Recall is one of the most powerful cards ever printed and in high demand in Vintage, while Fork and Word of Command's prices are what they are as a result of collector demand for cards from Magic's very first set. So, those are the 10 most expensive instants in Magic. If you want to own any of these cards, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each of them. If you want to make sure you catch the next video, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past MTG Top 10s, including many more that look at the most expensive cards in Magic, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.